Hello and welcome to another of our live conversations on Let's Talk Leadership. Joining us today is Patrick Sweet, who's joining us from Sweden, where there's heavy snow on the ground as it's being shown, and also our friends and colleagues at Let's Talk Leadership, Brit and Ian. As usual, there's a link that you can connect to us on, so if you want to ask any questions or challenge the opinions that are going to be expressed this morning, then please do so on YouTube. But we're going to be talking about something that, in fact, we've been having some conversations about how we quite frame this, but we want to explore leadership in the context of some of the dilemmas that all of us face in making choices, particularly when we're leading teams, leading others, or just ourselves as individuals. So I'm going to ask Brit to start with a quote, and then we're just going to see where the conversation goes. So Brit, over to you.
Right, yeah, the quote that I want to throw in as a start is from an 18th century statesman and philosopher called Edmund Burke. Irish, I believe, but don't quote me on that one. And what he said was, all that is needed for evil to succeed is for good men, and I suppose in the current context, we should say for good people, to do nothing. And it was something that was quoted by Stephen Colbert, the US talk show host, when he took issue with the amount of fake news that was spreading. And I just find it made me think, and I've been thinking about it for a few days now. And it goes back to your question, Matthew, the things that we do, the actions that we take, either as leaders of companies or as leaders of ourselves, and the actions that sometimes we don't take when people do not act. What's the consequence of that?
Yeah, and you said to me the other day, Brit, that you'd been discussing this with your husband, and he said, well, it sounds as though everything is leadership, or, you know, surely there's some boundary around it. And I know we sort of thought that actually we disagree with that comment, that actually everything is leadership. It's not sort of surrounded by some boundaries.
No, it's not. It's wider than that. But the word leadership is usually used in a much smaller context. But I guess that's part of what we're about, that we try to broaden that scope, and especially for young people, to say that, you know, choosing to take action in order to achieve something that you find is worthwhile is an act of leadership.
Yeah. Well, it requires voice. It requires making your voice heard. And something's happened, I think, in popular culture over the past 25, 30 years, where if you take a voice that is party aligned, it becomes politically correct. And somehow we've begun attacking each other, in my opinion. Even our leaders have begun laying things out in terms of political correctness, or saying a voice that is party aligned, I guess is a cumbersome way of saying it. But because even if you're on the left or the right, depending on where you're from, if you make a statement for or against something like Trump or whatever, it's a politically correct statement for somebody on your side. And it's a politically, but it's this notion of voice and getting this balance, at least for me, between creating the opportunity for people to express their voices and downplaying the political partiness of it. Now, I say political party not to drive us towards a conversation about politics, but the party nature of it. I should be able to express my voice, express my interest, express my concern without necessarily being ideologically categorized, put in a camp.
Mm-hmm.
Use a word that I think is happening.
I think the challenge with that is that sometimes the angriest voices are the loudest, and so they assume a sort of a scope, whereas the silent majority just sits back and looks and listens and sees it and thinks, oh my goodness, what's happening? So voice is also sometimes angry voice. And aggressive voice.
You know, and there's something that hits me about that, and we deal with it at home. You know, I have 2 teenagers at home, and sometimes the conversation gets a little bit sharp, a little bit angry. Not on my side, of course. I'm always even keel. I'm never angry about that. But what I've noticed is that the tempo of conversation tends to look like a chat stream. In other words, for some reason, we seem to be in our voice learning to communicate through these chat streams, and therefore it gets more aggressive. So I'm picking up on what you're saying. Chat streams are very aggressive. I never used to have those kinds of conversations in something like this, but after the social media has given that kind of incivility room to speak, it then enters everyday parlance. It used to be chats were just sort of, oh, somebody flaming. I don't know if anybody remembers that term, but somebody would be flaming online and you would accept it as just sort of that, but it's become so commonplace. So now this notion of angry voice and voice is really confused. Do we learn? Do we know how to express our voice without being angry?
But and that has, to me, and picking up on your point, Patrick and Brit, that to me has been really evident in the last 48 hours. So, and you see it at what I think is becoming a really horrible pitch, and that's the rage, because it is rage, that's going on throughout Europe about the distribution of vaccine and who's paid for what and who agreed what and when. And it's gone from, isn't it wonderful that we've got several companies, BioNTech in Germany, AstraZeneca, there's Johnson & Johnson, there's Moderna, there's various others, Novavax or whatever it was, all coming out. You know, the news was, isn't this wonderful? This is going to help us. And within a few weeks of that happening, we're all at each other's throats, showing no leadership at all about who paid for what, why we haven't got it. If you look at the streams in the European press that I was looking at this morning, it's moved away from how do we help people across the world to receive vaccines in a timely fashion into arguments about game playing, politicking, arguing about, you know, whether Boris Johnson has got one over on the rest of Europe by taking a risky decision and it just happened to work, or whether, you know, Spanish newspapers are thinking that somehow the EU needs to get its act together. And there was a piece by Sir Jeremy Farrar the other day, the head of the Wellcome Foundation, who made the point that, you know, vaccination as an example is one area where real leadership could be shown worldwide, as opposed to in this narrow, let's shout, let's argue, let's get back into punching each other up. And he was making the point that, you know, that we need to see this globally. There needs to be recognition that if we don't support people in other parts of the world who are less fortunate than us, the vaccine, the COVID virus will simply mutate and mutate and mutate and get to a point where none of us are safe. But if you read the social chat, if you read the press around Europe in the last 48 hours, it's all just become an enormous great street fight. It's just people punching each other and scoring political points. And there's no leadership at all. No, not at all. And so that angry voice point that you made, Patrick, and the sort of the way the chat suddenly becomes very brutal, is evident just in right across the press this morning.
And the incivility, I like that word that you used, Patrick. The incivility is normalized somehow. It's somehow it's okay to hurl abuse at one another.
Yeah, I'm using that word because I started doing some searching about it, and there's actually some leadership work on incivility. I'm not really that impressed with it, but it's a good start in terms of, I hate to say it, but maybe there are some fundamental relational things that we assumed were ingrained by now, and the media has washed that away. I don't mean to blame the media. I'm just saying the way we communicate through media, let me put it that way, has washed that away in some way. And I see it when at home. In other words, I've said, you know, sitting in the car, hey, this conversation is sounding more like a Facebook chat than it is a conversation about where we're going to have dinner or whatever. And it does lift up the awareness. It does just by bringing that out, point to some of the incivility of it. And I think this idea of, you know, we have to figure out how to create the space for voice, but we have to also encourage a civil way of expressing that voice and not be politically correct or incorrect. I mean, there's three poles there. And I think leaders though at least I have a personal experience with one in my current organization, who 5 years ago, I had said something about something, and he said, that sounds like hyperbole, or hyperbole. I'm not sure how you say that. And I was shocked because I didn't think it was. But in fact, I had used a phrase, salting the earth. I had used a phrase that actually accelerated the conversation in the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And I haven't done it since then. Literally, when I start thinking of these phrases, I have that in my head. Mm-hmm. And he was very gracious that he didn't, take that further. I just stopped. And I think we need to be able to give each other permission, and leaders need to role model this permission to hold each other accountable to our civility.
Yeah.
Is it possible then, because our mission at Let's Talk Leadership, Matthew, Brit and Patrick, is to maybe share some wisdom to our younger viewers and listeners around their leadership journey, and how they can, dare I say it, avoid some of the pitfalls that even the four of us have tripped over and are seeing in the world right now. But if we can't vaccinate against whatever this is, can we actually medicate through more leadership and promote what we do? Because when there are many angry voices going on, surely listening is much more important, and that ability to first seek to understand other people before being understood, and actually promote many of the things that have been true about leadership since we started actually even calling it leadership, whatever it was called in the beginning of time. But all the books behind me on the bookcase, I'm sure, Patrick, you have many similar and also different versions of this stuff. So what is it we should be doing? Because we're missing the point here, aren't we? Everybody's wanting to be unique and different, have a voice, but they're so busy shouting, they're not listening. And many times people are violently agreeing. And fake news right now is filling all the spaces. And there are people going into hospitals with video cameras to try and prove that this is all a hoax. And it's so sad, because on one hand, I admire people for challenging the establishment, sure. But then what's your motivation? Because are you creating therefore more anxiety in a world that needs more clarity? It's a frustrating time, but there must be some leadership in terms of not people, but in terms of behaviors that we can encourage people to do, and listening will be one of them, and being curious, asking more questions, I guess, rather than making somewhat dangerous accusations or opinions that don't actually help the process, because it's a challenging time right now to exist.
Yeah.
Well, I had an organization ask us about they wanted more people to speak up, and they weren't really sure why they weren't. And as we went in and discovered, is that there are a lot of people were afraid. And so when I'm afraid and I finally speak up, I make it sound like it takes a while. It probably doesn't. But I'm not smooth. I'm not necessarily civil about it. If I'm afraid, my emotions take over. So I like the idea of listening. But Ian, how would you listen to me if I express a fear in an anger way? I mean, how would you turn that energy as a leader into something more constructive? Because I think I'm being constructive.
Well, of course, and I think that's the important thing on the receiving end. So imagine, Patrick, you were really directing something. Maybe I could take it personally, but if you were just offering such a strong viewpoint, and we've seen street videos of people who are adamant that they know the facts, they're adamant that what they hear is true, and it's hard for other people on the receiving end of that not to fight it back with logic and reasoning and counter, what's the term, alternative facts, or whatever is the right phrase. But not to react to it, because that's some of the leaders that I've worked for who can actually then just absorb a lot of that to get to the root of what the thing is, because that anger is often centered around fear, as you were saying, Patrick, and people, and when they do speak up, they're still fearful of what it means, but not reacting to it. And some of the leaders that I've worked for that have been I've been inspired by, that have been able to have an audience of, say, hundreds of people in a town hall or something, and be able to navigate that energy, which is resistance to whatever it is, the truth maybe they don't want to hear, or the facts they don't want to accept. That's the art, but that's compassion, it's patience, it's many things, and timing when you then give your opinion. because you must have a perspective. Of all the leaders, especially our young leaders watching this, at some point you have to have an opinion on it, or people will eventually not listen to you any further. And it doesn't have to be the party line, it could be something different, but you have to, it's a, we use this term a lot, it's a both and, isn't it? It's to accept and to absorb the emotion, the feeling, the beliefs that people have, and then create a conversation almost at the right level, not just at facts, but down deeper in that that tree, if you like, of communication levels. It's an art, isn't it?
I think so. I want to pick up on something you said, and then I'm going to ask Brit to answer it.
Who invited Patrick today? Come on. We're now in a workshop situation. Go for it, Patrick.
Yeah. You were talking about challenging and the positive element of people challenging the status quo. And I personally, in the space that I work, which is more humanitarian as a space, in other words, it's not necessarily profit driven. There's this idea of disruption and failing actually can cause lives. And so we can't necessarily embrace this great, let's be disruptive and let's fail fast and fail often, because as we see with COVID, it means lives, sometimes thousands. And so, but this notion of challenging status quo, I'm going to you now, Brit, this notion of challenging status quo, this notion of disruption, how do we know how to do that? And how do we know if it's gone too far? Because as a leader, as Ian was saying, you want the challenge to happen. Innovation comes from that, maybe.
Yeah, it does.
But I'm throwing a really hot one to you. When does it go too far? Because, some people say, well, Donald Trump, he's just a disruptor. Well, saying that in 2016 and seeing what that philosophy led to at that scale is scary to me.
Yeah.
But I do like the idea of disruption. So there you go.
Yeah, sure. If I had the answer, I wouldn't be sitting here, but I'm a good stab at it.
Okay, yeah, please do.
Yeah, I think that goes back maybe to the civil approach that you somehow should still have. I mean, you can challenge and you can disrupt and you can throw in something which shocks people a little bit. But I think once you start impinging on values such as people's freedom, or you start calling an entire nation a nation of rapists, or you transgress, and then it's I guess it's no longer disruption, but it becomes just insulting. And there's a big difference between those two, I think. And so never mind the facts, and never mind looking for actual evidence that what you think it might be true. There's some ground for it, but I think if you start randomly insulting for the sake of creating not disruption but conflict, real conflict, then you've crossed the line.
Thank you, because I don't necessarily make a nice separation between non-conflicting disruption and productive, which I guess would be productive disruption, and conflict-based disrupt, or conflict causing, or even conflict-based disruption. That was really useful for me, because I've been struggling with that, because I like the idea of disruption, but I've been very tight.
My preference is, if there's a rule, I will find out if I can get around it somehow, because I don't like to be booked. I like to disrupt or to disobey in my own sort of little way, but it's I guess it's also about your motivation. If you are a leader and you want to boost innovation, then it makes sense to say, hey, hello, why do our cars have 4 wheels, or what, just disrupt the status quo and ask questions. But when it comes to, hey, I'm going to insult, I'm going to find out how in one tweet I can get the maximum amount of horrible words addressed at you, because I hate you, and I hope that other people will read it and hate you too. That's no longer, in my view, a love of innovation. That is simply, I don't have a word for. I don't have a polite word for that.
You gave me another gift. Thank you. You gave me another gift to help me sort this out. for me. I'm not sorting it out for anybody else. I'm really struggling with it. So, but what you said was motive. And so why are we being disruptive? And if somebody's being disruptive for innovation, which sounds like a positive change, at least it's a change. Okay, but the other side, when do people disrupt and they're not motivated for innovation per se, or innovation is used as a veil? They're disrupting for power. And so the gift you gave me is that if I see the disruption, if I can make an assessment at the moment, is this a disruption? Why do cars have four wheels? Is this a disruption that's leading towards some kind of constructive thing that we all might gain by? And or is this a disruption that is power-based? It's intended to cause conflict, like some children can do between parents. Divide and conquer kind of thing. But the gift you just gave me was to ask myself, when I feel uncomfortable, if Ian throws something innovative at me, if I feel uncomfortable, I should ask myself, is he doing a power play, which is what I'm afraid of, or is he just challenging my flathead view of things?
Yeah.
And that'll help me. So yeah, from a leader's standpoint, if I feel uncomfortable with something somebody challenges, I should look inside myself and ask, do I think it's power or innovation? And if I'm not sure, ask the person. In other words, try to find out in the situation. That's useful for me.
Seek to understand, like what Ian said. Yeah.
I mean, I think the work that you do, Patrick, and also the work that Nadia Huben was talking about a few weeks ago in terms of human rights and promoting sort of people's lifestyles that are often held in ridicule or criticized or even ostracized, as being their right, is that at the level we're talking about, it seems like adult talking to adult, and if you can rationalize and work it through. But when you take it into a leadership role where either in an organization where you're being paid by a group of people, shareholders, stakeholders, community groups, or whatever, to get the job done, then you are constantly being confronted with a dilemma between, how do I stay true to the group of people that have asked me to do the very best for them, and also deal with situations that the organization I represent comes up again, which are patently wrong, or discriminatory or unfair to parts of society which I might suggest at one level I'm not a part of. So for instance, I might be selling, I'm going to use the example, I might be a company selling sportswear all around the world, but I'm actually in the chain, the sort of the, if you like, the logistics chain. That sportswear is being produced somewhere else in the world.
Yep.
And every now and again it bubbles to the surface that, whoops, those people are in another part of the world being paid very, very little in awful circumstances to produce something that I'm selling at 150 euros to some, middle-class family in Europe or America. And hey, we can justify it because we're keeping those people in another part of the world employed, and they wouldn't be employed if we weren't doing it. So from a leadership point of view, there is a dilemma. I'm generating wealth, in inverted commas, for organizations in another part of the world, which might even be located in the part of the world whose values are very different to mine, or the ones I profess as part of an organization or a team of senior executives. And at the same time, I'm providing employment through sales and marketing and logistics and procurement and everything to a whole group of people that I'm being asked to be responsible for. And ultimately, hopefully, I'm creating some profit for the people who invested in this endeavor initially. And if you then, and those to me seem to be dilemmas, there is no answer to it, but it is a dilemma. And I would suggest in all of us, it's too easy to fall into well, I know some of this stuff is not very nice, but ultimately it's for the better of what we're doing, so I'll go with it.
Mm.
How do you compare the dilemma of a student walking in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square, which was leadership in its true raw sense, with a leader in an organization that we might work with having to struggle with a dilemma about, do they furlough people or not? Do they recruit from a particular sector of society? We have a diversity policy, but actually, does it mean anything in reality? There seem to be, in all of this, real moral dilemmas that it would at least be nice to see the leaders that we know recognizing that they are struggling with this, rather than just coming out with either aggressive statements or bullying or criticism of someone else because they themselves can't actually put their hand up and say, look, I feel vulnerable about this. I really don't have an answer to it, and I don't like it, but this is the situation we're in. You very rarely hear anyone in a leadership situation saying that. And the other thought I had too was going back to something that Bob Johansson talks about, the Institute for the Future. The hindsight piece is easy. We can all be better looking back on what we did and saying, if only we knew, we could have done this. But he stresses the foresight and the insight. And I'm just thinking from a leadership point of view, how much do we encourage ourselves or others to have real foresight? So to say, we don't know the answers, but let's try and think about possibilities and then see if we gain some insight from it. So going back to the argument about vaccines, I don't understand why we have to have this sort of, let's attack the jugular every time anyone does something which someone else perceives as being aggressive or bullying or supporting their own particular viewpoint. Wouldn't it be nice if leaders were able to say, there's a bigger thing here than just how we feel. What if we allow this to continue to happen? What is likely to happen, and what insight does it give us as to how we need to behave differently, and then take action accordingly? Because I don't know about you, I just get frustrated by seeing, I watched, there was a wonderful example, a really good example this morning. I watched a film clip of a CEO talking about the strategy of an organization. And one of the three things was our role in society. Yeah. And the CEO was quite clear about what that meant, and that was going to be used, if you like, as the touch point for everything they were going to do in the future. Everything, regardless of what they were producing or how they were producing it, it was going to be set against the backdrop of how does this impact on the wider society, the good of the wider society. And I think all that needs to be encouraged.
It really does. And I have to confess here, I'm going to come out of the closet as an economist. Don't hold it against me. But our basic thinking about the purpose of enterprise has shifted since 1950. I'm not going to hold up prior to that as being any great example of industrialism. But what we've done since 1950 through Milton Friedman, and we've taken the works of the invisible hand farther, where we just say, if we put the interest of ourselves and the interest of the shareholder first, everything will work out. It's a moral philosophy that's kind of bankrupt, to use a really direct term. And you're suggesting something entirely different. And it's happening in different places. The WF, guy named Krauss, I think, just came out with some putting people in planet as the center and business as the periphery. And he wrote a dissertation in '71 where he had business as the center and then everything else around. And so we have to somehow flip this, as Sanji says, this mental model of business at the center and replace it. And some people are doing it with people, planet, or our impact at the center. And business is just a function of that. And leaders need to role model that. Yeah. I'm fortunate to work for an organization that's trying to do that. We don't always get it right, but it tries, and it's trying even harder now because it has to. But that shift needs to happen, and that is a leadership shift. That is a shift that can only be role modeled. We need to role model. We need to say it, and we need to continue to say it.
Yeah, that's a shift towards. That sounds towards leadership, servant leadership, where as a leader you realize that you need to get. That's not about you, and it's not about your business, and it's not about your profit, but it's about something wider, which might be less sexy, or it might give you less money or less power, but it needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, currently it gives you less money. Currently it gives you less power. Those are all, back to the economist side, those are all incentives that are structurized. We can adjust those incentives if we choose to. Right now, the CEO's incentive is to shareholder value, for the most part. If we had a different set of incentives, I think it would change. And I think it's not only role modeling it, but it is indeed saying what you're saying. We need to shift what we have as a target. Yeah. I thought I heard Ian mentioning something there in the background.
Many thoughts going through my mind. I'm just thinking about how many world leaders do we know right now who have sacrificed, whatever age they are, their vaccine for somebody who needs it more than them, so they eat last or they get vaccinated last. I don't know of anybody who's publicly said, I'm not going to have the vaccine. I want it and I need it, but I'm not going to have it until I'm happy that everybody within my flock is looked after, and then I'll have my vaccine. I mean, that's leadership, in my opinion, and it's having a just cause. It's putting yourself last, but still looking after yourself. But yeah, this I think we can do much to promote much better role modeling. And there are some wonderful people out there, as we've seen with the people we're coaching, Matthew and Brit, and the people that we've had on these sessions together. That there are people to look to who are actually role modeling this stuff, and we see it in the press every day, and yet we're still busy arguing about what the bigger, more powerful people are doing. It's a real shame, because it's these principles are simple, aren't they? They're the foundation of what we believe about leadership, and yet we're just not seeing behaviors align. It's rather hypocritical, I think, Patrick, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think that we in this room or in this space, and people who have been talking about leading and leadership for a long time, have skirted the issue. Well, sorry, not the issue. I wish there was just one issue, because if there was just one, we'd fix it, right? But we skirt things, and we find ourselves in the dilemmas that Matthew was speaking about earlier, where we're competing in our heads to serve multiple stakeholders. And the only thing I know how to do, and it's part of where my life has gone, is to try to put myself in the path of organizations that at least are thinking broader, if I can. And that's the big one. As the economy constricts and contracts, and my opportunities become, because of where I work, there's a lot to get done. But if I was only working with commercial enterprise, they would be becoming less, perhaps. And that dilemma becomes even more tight. It becomes even harder to make those choices, and which is in fact the time when we need leaders and to demonstrate and to role model that we need to put something else in front as the target, and business is of service to that. Most moral philosophers have talked about that. It's just honestly since 1950 that our business schools, literally our business schools and some schools of government, when they look to the business world and say, let's adopt the business model so we serve our publics, which I think was a mistake. It's been since then that we have put the invisible hand in front and said it'll work its way out. And guess what? It's not working its way out. It's really not. There's a false. And so how do we learn from that? How do we learn in an Anglo society that our primary ethos for 60 years of economy and expansion, that it's flawed? How do we confront that? I'm asking everybody, how do we confront that?
One of the things that's just gone through my mind is something around self-interest. Mm-hmm. If as human beings, all of us are self-interested. at the very basic level, whether it's survival, whether it's caring for our own families and wider communities, but there is a self-interest. And so trying to make a mind shift that says, let's move away from self-interest and move into that space that says other people's interests will enable, if we encourage them in a constructive way, will help our self-interest. You know, the self-interest will naturally fall out of us showing some interest in other people. There is a tremendous risk in that, because history will show us that if we allow others to express their self-interest, we sometimes get into very, very difficult situations, you know, and we can all think of the global historical things that have happened. So just as you try to take the tentative step as a leader to say, actually, there is a wider good here that we as an organization ought to be promoting, because if we do that, it will help our own organization. There's always someone out there saying, yabba dabba do, we can take advantage of it and screw them or beat them up or pinch a bit of their land or steal their water supplies or whatever it might be. And so you get drawn back into the reality of how do I as a leader take a course of action that A, doesn't put the people I'm responsible for into a more risky, exposed position, even though I think it's the right one. Secondly, if I do it, will anyone else do it as well? So will there be a collective enterprise in society that says, you know, we all need to do this? Or will there be someone out there who just sees it as an opportunity to promote their own particular cause, knowing that somehow by, if you like, opening up and talking about the greater good, we've exposed ourselves to criticism, to challenge, you know, all of that. That seems to be at the heart of all of this. Mm-hmm. So even though a leader might want to share some of the vaccine they've got with another part of the world, as soon as they say that, there will be a community that they represent saying, why are you doing that? What about us? Your main job is to support us. Now, we had this in the United Kingdom a few months ago when the British government decided to cut back on the amount of money they were spending on overseas aid from 7% of GDP to 5%. The actual amount of money was tiny in compared to the total GDP of the United Kingdom. But the argument was, why are we sending money to India, which is a large country, when we should be spending it on X or Y here at home? Perfectly understandable comment to make. But to me, it just seemed like we were being pulled back into the self-interest piece, and that opportunity which had been created earlier to be a little bit more inclusive and global had been lost. And it's back to Sir Jeremy Farrar's comment from Wellcome Foundation, you know, and I hope I'm not quoting him directly, but you know, the comment he was making was that if we don't have a more global leadership view of some of these things, whether it be the environment, the pandemic or whatever, we're all still in the same blooming sticky boat that we've always been in. And it needs someone to step forward and say, we are going to distribute the vaccine, even though we've got lots of it. You know, does the United Kingdom really need 300 million doses? You know, the Germans were rushing to buy 80 million and weren't they pleased as punch they got it from BioNTech? The whole thing became an argument about, well, we did it better than the others, or we've had more people vaccinated. All of that is just, to me, is leadership at the very worst. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how you get past self-interest bit, because it's a natural human condition.
Yes, and it's probably exacerbated by fear. Because let's face it, there's a sort of a chronic element of all of us globally having had their fear levels raised to some extent, more or less, depending on where you are and what your situation is. But that, I'm afraid that sparks more anger and therefore less understanding and less collaboration across borders.
Can I chip in there a second, actually? But you can't see me, guys, I'm afraid. But isn't it the responsibility of leaders, like global leaders, after the population that they after? For example, the government of the United Kingdom look after the people of the United Kingdom, and thus the leaders of Europe and everything else. How do they how do they tackle that?
Mm.
You know, balance that in the weight of, you know, looking after the world as a whole.
I think it's a great statement, isn't it? Because it's yes, and also to play a part in the world stage. One of the questions, Richard, that I've often been challenged by, and I think it's a great leadership question, particularly for young leaders, again, is who are you performing for?
Hmm.
You know, who is your performance measured by? And it's really difficult because there are many different camps, there are many different stakeholder groups, or however you want to define it. If you're performing for one of which is you, obviously, for your own motivation, satisfaction, and ego, etc. But yeah, it's a both and, I think, Richard, and that ratio, that balance, can be wildly out of shape at times. In the short term, maybe that's okay, but in the long term, it can be disastrous because we just polarize the world, and we're very happily all correct, and not very well connected. You know, it's horrific. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd look at it. You know, we talk in the work that we do, all of us, Patrick, Brit, Ian, you as well, all of us talk about the need for collaboration and talk about the need for interdependency. And there've been incredible examples, and I have to come back to the immediate experience in the UK. The National Health Service in the UK has shown collaboration like never ever before. You know, hospitals sharing resources across the country, sharing patients, cleaners becoming patient movers, you know, senior consultants, the people up there on our TV, you know, rolling up their sleeves and getting out on the night shift to look after patients in hospitals. And that's, to me, has been real leadership in the raw. So what we're saying is, why can't that happen? If that can work in an enormous organization like the NHS, one of the largest employers in the world, whatever it is, 1.4 million people, if that can happen, then surely it's not beyond the wit of man that it could happen at an international level. At least if the mindset was, yes, picking up your point, Richard, I'm elected as the leader of this country or the leader of this organization or this team, and my main responsibility is to make sure that the people I lead are looked after. But that shouldn't stop me from recognizing that whatever I do or our team doesn't have an impact on something somewhere else in the world that may eventually be even more important than our immediate need.
Yeah, or even come back to bite you.
Or come back to bite you. So to give you an example, if you, using say the economic support, if the rich nations of the world don't support the poor nations of the poor nations of the world will continue to develop in poverty and insecurity, and out of that will become instability, which is the very thing that the richer nations of the world would have on their please don't allow this to happen wish list. You know, the very behavior creates the conditions that they're trying to stop. And I would say, as leaders, you know, even in a small team, are we doing things ourselves that actually ultimately, without any foresight and insight, create the very things that we don't want to happen in the longer term? Mm-hmm. I think I'd say it like that, perhaps. Patrick, you were.
Well, Britt said something earlier that helped me sort out this bit about some of the dilemmas we face, in particular around disruption. But she mentioned something about values. And as I was listening to the conversation rolling forward, it came to me when you said, why should the UK, I mean, you weren't saying it yourself, but the argument came up in the UK, why should we send more money outside when we need it at home? So let's change 7% to 5%, and let's do that. When in fact, the question is not a bad question, but we should be asking ourselves perhaps the other way around, not why are we sending money? The question is, why do we need to send money?
Right.
And is there something that we're doing that is causing us to have to repair? Because in a sense, that money that is spent out that way through that channel is a reparation. And so instead of asking, why are we sending money? We should be asking ourselves, perhaps, why are we spending money the way we spend it when we buy the things we buy? If we spent our money differently in a more direct fashion, being more fully aware of the supply chain oppression that happens, we might consider how we spend that money. And maybe that's the most highest leverage place to actually make that 7% happen. In other words, say, no, I'm going to buy here because, or buy from these organizations because they at least pay a living wage. And make those kinds of supply chain oppressions transparent, because then instead of paying my tax every year into the government, which supports a few people, and then that money goes further, the 7% goes out, but it's not the 7% I put in. I put in X, and there's a percent that's supporting the government, which is fine, but it's not direct. How can we make these impact, as you were saying, my team's impact, how can we make these impact chains more visible? Because I would prefer to buy something from an organization that's guaranteeing a living wage than to buy something cheap, have money at the end of the year, get taxed, have the government then take that 7% and send it back to the people who aren't getting a living wage. So I guess that's a long way of me sort of going through that. There's a values thing there that comes up in terms of my pecuniary interest, my monetary interest, and my other humanitarian interests. And we don't make those things transparent enough. And with today's IT, with today's instant communication, and with today's ability to take my phone and go walk around, we should be able to make these things transparent so that I can make these choices. An example of this transparency that just happened right now is this GameStop. I don't know if you've heard about that, where the Wall Street has been shorting the stock and took it from hundreds down to zero. And a group of people on Reddit got together, Reddit, which is a large online community, and said, you know what, we like GameStop. We're GameStop. We're gonna stop this. And they started buying stock deliberately, got it back up to 350. And the hedge funds who have been shorting it are out. That happened because of transparency. And these kinds of things, I guess transparency is something that some people will stop, and is something that a value that some people can leverage. And as a leader, I think we can do a lot to make as much transparent, as ugly as it is, as possible.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's perhaps leave it on that thought that maybe out of the discussions we've been having this morning, then just being more transparent about everything we do, whether it's the views we hold or the values we hold or the impact that us and the teams that we work with have on others, maybe that's a good place to set in motion other thoughts. And what would be really great is if people watching this, and I hope it doesn't sound too self-indulgent, actually put some comments together or come back and challenge some of the things we've been talking about this morning. Because you know, one of the other aspects about leadership is being open to different voices, which is where probably we started at the beginning of the conversation about 40 minutes ago. Patrick, thanks for joining us today. It's been great. Good to see you again.
Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
It's great. And Ian and Brit, thank you as well. We'll be in touch shortly. But and those of you, if you watch this, there'll be more of these live conversations coming up. We've got various different topics planned for the next few weeks. So look forward to seeing you. But if you have been listening, thank you very much. And if you do listen and watch, great, enjoy it.
Yeah, thanks for your work. Thanks for your work very much.
See you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.